Why is it important for a writer to know the ending of their story before they begin their pages?
Right. I mean, most of the people that we interviewed in the book that we wrote, Screenwriter's Advice, almost all those pro writers that we did, almost all 34 down to T, said that that was important. I think you just need to know where you're going. If it's a whole thing, a story. So it's everything that you've set up in Act 1 or at the beginning needs to come to a crescendo at the climax and wrap up at the end. And, I think if you don't know where you're going to, it's very easy to get lost along the way. You might follow tangents of story threads that don't take you there to where you want to go. Now, sometimes that might be good because, as I said before, that might be nuances that you didn't explore before. But generally speaking, once you have a sense of the world, once you know what's in that world, you know what you want to say, you know what potential endings are. You know where it's possible ways of where that story is going to go. Okay? There might be multiple choices. Maybe you choose the more obscure of them, but it's still authentic. And once you have that point in story time, then you can work backwards from there and say, okay, so the end of Act 2 might be that, because that would then, the character gets off their feet and they go towards that point, and then you're working backwards to the midpoint, and then you work backwards to Act 1, the journey start, the beginning of Act 2 where the journey starts that gets you to that point, and then you can go back into Act 1 where you set up the world that is different, where you start from who that character is, where they go and how they're different at the point, because you know where they are at the end. So the beginning, they have to be changed, they have to be changed on the way. So what would be either, the opposite of what they are or different from then? And that kind of tells you where your starting point is. How that world is, because, as we go through time, you can never go back anywhere. You can never go home again, so to speak. It's never the same. You're always changed as you go through time in life. So this is, if you know the end, then you can kind of sense, well, what would be the beginning of that, where that character starts. And also there's the idea that the inciting incident of a story is resolved by the climax. That's a very common story theory thing. So if you know what the climax is, you can say, okay, then what would be the starting point, that first choice that has to be made, or first problem presented that gets you to this point. And usually once you have this, all the other stuff is much easier to do, especially if you're doing something like a mystery or a thriller that's twisty. If you know where you're ending, you can kind of go back. It's like when, I remember talking to math teachers. Whenever they would have an algebraic problem on, I'd ask them, how did you know the answer is 6? How did you know that you would end up being 6? And they said, because I knew I wanted the answer to be 6, and then I did the equation backwards to the first line of the equation, okay? And I knew that if you did it properly, you would end up at 6. And that's another way of thinking about knowing the ending.
So that's not what's termed nonlinear storytelling?
No, nonlinear storytelling means you're breaking time in some way. You're using flashbacks or flash forwards or multiple storylines where you're bouncing back in time, or going to different points in time. A linear story would be like more of the traditional 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s story, like Rocky. You're with Rocky every scene as he goes forward to having that big fight at the end. That's kind of linear. One thing happens, the next thing happens, the next thing happens, solve a problem, next thing happens. That's linear. But obviously something like Memento, actually even Memento is kind of linear backwards, but something like The Avengers, where you have lots of different storylines going on, or I'm blanking on something with lots of flash forwards or flashbacks, but that's really what nonlinear storytelling is.
But even within nonlinear storytelling, then we would need to know the ending so that we could reverse engineer it, because it would be maybe too complicated otherwise?
I think it would be really helpful I think it would be really, really helpful. Like if, I can't imagine writing something like the Woody Harrelson True Detective, like that, like those episodes of something like that, where you didn't know where they want to go. Because there you are about that, it's non-linear, because you're going backwards and forwards, I think, to the murder, and because he's being interviewed in the present, but then you're going back in time to the actual events of the murder that they're trying to solve. And it's really twisty, and they're going every which way there in Louisiana. I couldn't imagine writing something like that without knowing how they're going to catch the person at the end.
How does a screenwriter not choose an obvious choice in their story?
Oh boy.
And
Okay.
what is an obvious choice?
Right. We have this exercise that we teach our students to do, and that writers can do that. I learned it a long time ago, which is you want to keep the audience guessing. If the audience can guess what's going to happen next, I think we've all been there when this is going to happen, and then it happens, and maybe once you're like, oh, look how smart I am. But if it keeps happening over and over and over again, they're going to say this line, they say the line. If you can see the plot, you know what's going to happen. That's not fun. You tune out to that sort of thing, or you turn it off, which is even worse. So if you can come up with the non-obvious choice, in that case, they've gone with an obvious choice where you could guess. Yes, that's the obvious thing that's the most logical thing the character can do. That's the most logical plot they can take. That's the most logical obstacle. In a way, it's not horrible because obviously it makes sense, but there's no intrigue there. There's nothing, maybe it's not, maybe some other paths could have been taken. And there's a exercise that we do with our students, along with other writers I worked with, is if you have a choice that a character can make based on the world that you know, and this is really helpful when you know your world really well and what the possible obstacles could be, right? What's the first thing you think that they could do? And then you write the first thing comes to mind, and then throw that away. What's the second thing that comes to your mind? Great, throw that away. The third, fourth, or fifth thing that you can think up, that's usually the best choice, because it will work because it's within the world. It's a logical, sensible thing that could happen. But half the audience will probably think of the first thing. The other half of the audience might think of the second thing. But you have to get someone who's really tuned in who'll come up with third, fourth, or fifth thing, and they're like, yeah, I knew that they would do that. And if great, good on you, well done you know the world. So I think that taking the time to really think about the choices you make, either on how you're going to build a character, the obstacles the characters have, or the choices that they need to make when interacting with other characters or antagonistic forces, finding something a little bit offbeat but still works within what you've set up, that's a way to make things interesting, to keep your audiences guessing and to keep them engaged.